بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين لا سيما بقية الله في الأراضين أجل الله تعالى فرجه الشريف اللهم أخرجني من ظلمات الوهم وأكرمني بنور الفهم اللهم افتح علينا أبواب رحمتك وانشر علينا خزائن علومك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Alhamdulillah, we have tawfiq to continue our study of Introduction to Usul al-Fiqh, or Principles of Jurisprudence, based on the book by Ayatollah Mutahhari. We had the first lecture on the first lesson of the book. We talked about the meaning of fiqh and the relation between fiqh and usul al-fiqh and the significance of usul al-fiqh. We didn't give a very clear definition of usul al-fiqh in the last session. Of course, that was following the design of the book and the order of the book. And part of it is because we need to know more about the lesson today so that we can better understand the definition of usul al-fiqh. So inshallah, towards the end of this session, I hope we get chance to talk about definition of usul al-fiqh. But basically, you realized in the last session that usul al-fiqh is like a methodology for fiqh. Gives us rules and guidelines for istinbat, for inference of Islamic rulings from their sources. We said fiqh is to do your utmost for drawing Islamic rulings from their detailed, original, first-hand sources. Usul al-fiqh is the knowledge about the rules and guidelines for this process of istinbat or istinbat or ijtihad, drawing the rulings out of the sources. Our fiqh, in order to be Islamic, certainly needs some Islamic basis. You cannot call something Islamic unless it is inspired by Islam. Yes, sometimes people expand the meaning of Islamic, and anything that Muslims do or happen in the Muslim world or Muslim culture, they may call it Islamic. You remember when we were talking about meaning of Islamic sciences, we talked about this. But Sharia is not something that can be accepted as Islamic unless it is derived from and is based on Islamic sources. In Shia fiqh, we have 4 sources. We call them al-adillatul arba'ah. Adilla is plural for dalil. These are 4 sources that our fiqh depend on them. And actually, in the book Shia Islam Origins, Faith and Practices, I have said that not only our fiqh, our aqaid is also based on this, our akhlaq is based on this, our economy is based on this. Anything Islamic is based on this. Quran, or briefly they call it al-Kitab, the book, which means the Quran. Sunnah, and we will explain that Sunnah refers to the sayings and deeds and approval of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt. Ijma', consensus, and aql, reason or intellect. So our fiqh depends on these 4. Anything which is presented as Islamic ruling for our action, for our practice, must be either from the Quran or from Sunnah or from consensus or from aql. Sometimes maybe more than one. For example, can be Quran and Sunnah both. Sometimes it's Quran and Sunnah and aql or ijma. But at least one of these must be available. Faqih needs to show either based on the Quran or Sunnah or ijma or aql, show evidence for his fatwa, for his opinion. Al-Kitab, As-Sunnah, Al-Ijma, Al-Aql. But other schools of Islam, they may have different views. For example, Hanafis, they follow Abu Hanifa. They have also four, but they say Kitab, Sunnah, Ijma, and Qiyas. Instead of Aql, they mention Qiyas. Some other people don't appreciate Qiyas that much. For example, Malikis, especially Hanbalis, they don't appreciate Qiyas that much. They have other things. Shafi'is are more accepting Qiyas than Hanbalis and Malikis. They have a middle position, but they are not emphasizing just as much as Abu Hanifa does. They have istihsan, they have masalih mursalih, fathu zara'i, saddu zara'i. They have different things in order to find out Islamic rulings, especially because they are not like Shia benefiting from the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. You know, we Shia are very fortunate because after the demise of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, up to the time of ghaiba, occultation, we had presence or hudur of ma'soom. We have received thousands of hadiths about fiqh, in addition to aqaid, akhlaq, etc. But about fiqh itself, we have received thousands of hadiths from our imams. Just Imam Baqir and Imam Sadiq have left us thousands of hadiths. But our Sunni brothers, they don't have this treasure. Plus, when it comes to the hadith of the Prophet, because there was a ban on narrating, registering, writing, compiling hadith from the time of the first Khalifa up to the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, towards the end of the first century. So for almost 90 years, for 3-4 generations, or even more, because it goes to up to time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, but you can say every 30 years is one generation, for example, every 20, 25 years. So for 3-4 generations, they didn't have freedom to narrate hadith of the Prophet. And then when they started documenting, it created a kind of gap. So because Shia don't have none of these two problems, therefore we don't need to do qiyas. We don't need to do istihsan or masalih mursalih and others. We have enough of guidance in the form of hadith from Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and we have lots of also general principles and guidelines for the areas that we don't have a specific direction. Plus we have aql as a source. So alhamdulillah, we are very fortunate and we are very rich in this area. So what we want to do in this lesson is to have a quick review of these 4 sources for the Shia jurists. We will mention a little bit the idea of Abu Hanifa about qiyas. But as I said last week, and I think Brother Mustafa has shared with you, in the series on Usul al-Istinbat, which is titled Al-Ijtihad wa Taqlid, from lecture 7, we have discussed all these things according to our Sunni brothers. Qiyas, Istihsan, Masalih Mursaleh, Fath al-Zara'i, Sadd al-Zara'i, we have discussed all of them there. And inshallah you are given the link, or you will be given soon. Our focus here is on these 4. Okay, let's start first with Al-Kitab, which is the noble and glorious Quran. Quran is more than 6,000 verses. Depending on how you count, some people say, 6,666, for example. Some people say 6,000, few hundred. There are some differences in counting, whether Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is counted or not. But in any case, it's above 6,000 verses. Out of these 6,000 verses, about 500 verses are directly related to fiqh, about salat, about zakat, about hajj, about inheritance, about divorce, different aspects of fiqh, about khums. So you can say 1 in 12 of the Quran is about fiqh directly. These verses are called Ayatul Ahkam, verses of the rulings, because these are related to Ahkam Shari, religious rulings. 500. And you, I'm sure, appreciate that in 500 verses you cannot go into all the details. These 500 verses give us the general framework and some details. More details are learned from Sunnah. For example, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli." Say your prayer as you see me saying my prayer. He was teaching them how to say prayer. Many details are not there in the Quran. Many rulings about fasting, about tahara, are not in the Quran. Some rulings are in the Quran, but also the framework is in the Quran. Muslim scholars, including the Shia scholars, from the beginning always refer to the Quran as the main source of fiqh, in addition to other areas. For us, the Quran is the main source. And as I have said many times, Hadith is the second, but not second in the sense of next to the Quran. Hadith or Sunnah, more generally speaking, is the second, but not second at the same level of the Quran. Is coming as subordinate to the Quran. Our Hadith or Sunnah in general explains and exemplify and illustrate Quranic teachings. Otherwise, our main source is the Quran, and Sunnah goes back to the Quran. So, Muslims, Shia, Sunni, have been referring to the Quran from the beginning. Ayatullah Mutahhari has a very, very brief discussion here about the emergence of akhbari movement. You appreciate that in such a short introduction to Usul al-Fiqh, he could not have expanded on this. But you can study more about this in other sources. And if needed, and I see that there are lots of question and interest, we can discuss ourselves about this. But very briefly he says, at the beginning of Safavid era, a kind of movement, a kind of approach emerged. And perhaps we can say the founder of this was Muhammad Amin al-Astarabadi. He was an Iranian, but he used to live for some time in Mecca and Medina. He has a book called Al-Fawaid al-Madaniyah, the benefits from Medina. And in that book, he introduced ideas that led to the formation of akhbarism in Shia school of thought. So they were Shia. And almost, you can say for the first time, according to Ayatollah Mutahhari, they said that we cannot refer to the Quran for religious rulings. They didn't question, of course, validity of the Quran, but they say the only people who can understand the Quran are the Prophet and Imams. A very famous hadith that they quote is إنما يعرف القرآن من خوطب به. The only one who understands the Quran is the one who is addressed by the Quran, or addressed by Allah in the Quran, meaning the Prophet. He understands the Quran. They said we cannot understand the Quran. We need only to refer to the Prophet and Imams. So Quran is Hujjah, but you don't have right to refer to the Quran. The only people who understand are the Prophet and Imam, so it means Sunnah, Hadith. So Hadith becomes very, very important for them. If there is Hadith, we understand. If there is no Hadith, we have to stop. Ijma' again was not interesting, because for them Ijma' was an influence coming from Sunni school of thought. They thought for Shia Ijma' is not important. Aql for them has no place in Sharia. Aql cannot come into the jurisprudence. So Ijma', Aql, they are not reliable. Quran is reliable but not understandable by us. The only thing that remains is Hadith, Akhbar. Akhbar means Hadith. It's plural for Khabar, and Khabar here means narration, Hadith. This is why they are called Akhbari, means we have to only refer to the Hadith. But something very interesting is that first they narrowed down everything to the Hadith. Quran, we don't understand directly. We have to take it from Hadith. Sunnah, no place for Sunnah. Aql, no place for Aql in Sharia, in understanding Fiqh. Only Hadith. But then when it comes to Hadith, they expand. They say you should not question Hadith. And they do two things here. One, when it comes to verification of hadith, they say don't investigate too much. You have to accept the hadith in reliable books, for example. Especially when it comes to al-Kutub al-Arba'ah, al-Kafi, al-Tahdhib, istabsar, man la yahdhuruhu al-Faqih. These four that are very important for all Shia. They say all the hadith in these four books are authentic. Don't question them. Even in other books they are very generous, but especially about these four. But our mujtahideen don't say this. Our mujtahideen, our ulama, the mainstream Shia fiqh doesn't say this. We don't have any sahih book of hadith as our Sunni brothers do. Our Sunni brothers have this concept of sahih for book, not for hadith. For a book, they said sahih means all authentic. Every hadith in this book is sahih. And they have sahih sitta. They have 6 books that they say they are all authentic. Of course, practically, they are not able to hold this position. It seems too idealistic. Therefore, they say, okay, if there are some conflicts, we prioritize Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari. Then again, between these two, some prefer Sahih Muslim, some prefer Sahih Bukhari. So they cannot hold the position that everything in these 6 books is Sahih. But this was the idea. Akhbaris somehow are similar, somehow, in the sense that they say Kutub Arba'ah are Sahih. And with respect to other books, they are more flexible. Our ulama say no. Even if a hadith is found in Al-Kafi, with all due respect and love that we have for Shaykh Kulayni and his book Al-Kafi, or in Tahdhib and Istabsar by Shaykh Tusi, with all their love and debt that we have towards Shaykh Tusi, all in Man La Yahduru al-Faqih, Shaykh al-Ta'ifa, Shaykh al-Saduq, still every single hadith must be investigated on its own. This is why we have Ilm al-Rijal. We check all the narrators of hadith one by one, because we don't have this concept that any book other than the Quran is all authentic. We have to investigate. So this is one area that akhbaris are different from usulis, from mujtahideen, from our mainstream ulama. Another area is not only akhbaris were very generous with authenticity of the hadith, they are also very generous in allowing people to go to hadith directly and understand them. They are too liberal, if you like, in the sense that they say we don't need mujtahid. Every Shia can go back to these books, read the hadith and act upon them. You don't need to worry about verification and about dalala or indication or meaning. Of course, some akhbaris later were moderate akhbaris, and they themselves were mujtahids, and they try to be not that simplistic or not to have that simplistic approach. Some akhbaris like Muhaqqiq Bahrani in Al-Hada'iq al-Nadhira, he's a good mujtahid, but there are different degrees of akhbaris. Those radical akhbaris, they say every person can go to the hadith. You know, we have some akhbaris today that they have their own, you know, like marja or point of reference. They refer to them, they ask, you know, for fatwa, whatever, but it's very not that sophisticated like our maraja, and the level of knowledge is not comparable. And I heard in some places, for example, many years ago, about maybe 30 years ago, I heard, you know, that, for example, in some places in Afghanistan, there are some akhbaris, or in Pakistan maybe, they just memorize hadith and refer to the books of hadith. Many of them memorize hadith and act upon it. In the same way that, for example, we take Risale of our marja, they take, you know, a book of hadith and act upon it. So this started at the beginning of Safavid era, and Muhammad Amin Astarabadi in Al-Fawaid al-Madaniyah laid the foundation for this understanding. Then it expanded. Some cities in southern Iran, some places in the Persian Gulf area, some people in holy cities in Iraq like Karbala, they adopted this movement. But then Agha Wahid Behbahani, who was a great faqih and mujtahid, had lots of discussions and debates, and he managed to again bring unity among Shia community in large. And although akhbarism remained, but it was very much in the margin. So for akhbaris, Quran is hujjah, but we don't have right to refer to the Quran. But apart from akhbaris, Quran is hujjah for us. And the only thing is that lots of details are not in the Quran, but whatever is in the Quran is hujjah, and we can understand. And zawahirul kitab are hujjah, not only nas, what is explicitly mentioned, but also al-ma'na al-zahiri is also hujjah, means those things which are apparent or outward meaning are hujjah. Then we come to sunnah. In sunnah, every Muslim accepts the validity of the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You cannot be a Muslim and question the validity of the sunnah of the Prophet. Why? Because what do we mean by sunnah? We mean whatever the Prophet said, or whatever the Prophet did, or whatever he approved. Taqreer. Taqreer means anything that happened in the presence of the Prophet and the Prophet didn't object. This means that this was okay. So Muslims don't have any problem with sunnah, but they have problems with two other subjects which come under sunnah. One, is sunnah something inclusive of imams, or is only Prophet? The Shia say, according to the teachings of the Prophet himself, we have to refer after him to imams. One example is Hadith al-Thaqalain, which is one example. إني تارك فيكم الثقلين كتاب الله وإترتي. So we have to refer to Ahlul Bayt. You can say we have to refer to Ahlul Bayt in order to understand the Sunnah of the Prophet. We don't want to say Ahlul Bayt are coming at the level of the Prophet. No, they are Ahlul Bayt al-Nabi. They represent the Prophet after his demise, because they know better than other people the Sunnah of the Prophet. They are not equal to the Prophet, as the Prophet is not equal to Quran or to the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hadith of the Prophet is not equal to the verses of the Quran, to the word of Allah. Also, Imams are not equal to the Prophet, but Prophet referred us to Imams and Quran. So some Muslims may have problem with this idea of including Imams, although, as we have said this in previous discussions about Shia Islam, we have said that they believe that Ashab, companions of the Prophet, are Hujjah, and Imams at least were companions of the Prophet, and then their next Imams were progeny of them, and they had received the knowledge through Imam Ali, Imam Hassan, and Imam Hussein. But at least Imam Ali, Imam Hassan, and Imam Hussein are companions of the Prophet, and whoever accepts companions as Hujjah should accept them. So, extent of Sunnah is something to be discussed, but otherwise no one questions the Sunnah of the Prophet. The second issue to discuss is how to receive the Sunnah. Sometimes Sunnah of the Prophet, or for us and Imams, but now because we want to talk about Islamic schools of thought, we focus on the Prophet. Sometimes the Sunnah of the Prophet is received through decisive hadith, khabar qat'i, decisive hadith, which are, for example, mutawatir. Mutawatir is a hadith that has been narrated by so many people in every generation that leaves no chance for mistake or for fabrication. Mutawatir. Or if it is not mutawatir, it is surrounded by so much of evidence that we are sure that this is from the Prophet, 100%. But sometimes hadith is received through reliable people. Maybe one, maybe two or three reliable people have narrated this hadith. We are not 100% sure, but rationally we can trust them. If a reliable person informs me about something in my worldly life, I would accept. This is the discussion about khabar wahid. Inshallah, we will talk about it later. The hadith of single person. Of course, even 2-3 people become wahid here. Means anything lower than mutawatir or mustafid. Something which is narrated a lot, but not to the level of tawatur. So, the second issue among Muslims about Sunnah is this: can we rely on reports of the Sunnah which are not decisive and certain? Abu Hanifa, for example, was very strict here. He was very strict about accepting hadith of the Prophet. Ayatollah Mutahhari says that it is said he only accepted 17 hadith of the Prophet about fiqh. 17. Can you imagine? He only accepted 17 hadith. So you should not be surprised that someone like Abu Hanifa promotes qiyas, and that is to go by similarity. You say we have a case A, we know the ruling about this. We have a case B, we don't know the ruling about this. B is similar to A, so we extend the ruling of A to B. This is qiyas. Just, in mantiq we say tamthil, it's analogy. By similarity, we extend the ruling of one case to another. You cannot understand, how someone can rely on this, but when they are deprived from the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and when they say we have only 17 hadiths from the Prophet that we can rely on, so how are you going then to solve the problem? There's a big gap. Then you have to use such things like qiyas or istihsan. Istahsana. Istihsan means you reflect on something and you say, this seems to be the case. It makes lots of sense to say this is the Islamic ruling based on our understanding. Or masalih mursalah means we consider the masalih, the interest in Sharia. What Islamic Sharia wants to do. Islamic Sharia wants to bring justice, welfare, I don't know, all these things. So based on that we can make the rulings. There is a need that they need to, meet, because there's a gap, big gap. I repeat again, narration of the hadith of the Prophet were stopped. Writing, registering, narrating stopped. They didn't refer to Ahlul Bayt, number 2. And number 3, they even have question about the hadith that they have from the Prophet. Then they have to fill the gap with other things. But some other schools of fiqh, some other madhahib, no, they are not that strict. They accept more hadith. For example, Shafi'i accept more hadith. Hanbali, Malikis, they accept more hadith than Hanafis. For Shia, hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam or imams is to be received through reliable chain of narrators, and we investigate them one by one, and we make sure that there is no one missing. We have a beautiful way of defining tabaqat or rawat. Every generation of narrators is defined. So if I hear a name, I can verify who is this name if more than one person has this name. How? Based on the people who have narrated from this person, and based on the people who have this person narrated from, we put them in a specific generation. And Ayatollah al-Uzma Burujerdi rahmatullah alayh was pioneered in this idea, and we have books on this. So hadith for us has to be checked, but we are not that strict that we only accept 17 hadith. We accept thousands of hadiths, but we check them one by one. And hadith can be qat'i because it is mutawatir, or it is mahfuf bil qara'in, or can be dhanni, it's not decisive, it is something that there is a chance of not being authentic, but we have reliable evidence. I cannot say, Wallahi, this hadith is from Imam Sadiq, but I can say, Wallahi, I have hujjah that this hadith is from Imam Sadiq, because reliable people have narrated this. This is another discussion, inshallah. Hujjat Academy, we discuss about this in Usul al-Fiqh. So this is about Sunnah. And here, we have ilm al-rajal. Also, we have ilm al-dirayat al-hadith, which talks about styles, manners, classifications of hadith and narrators. We have hadith al-sahih, we have hadith al-hasan, we have hadith al-muwathaq, we have hadith al-dha'if, we have maghbula, we have mursala, we have maqtu'a. We have many different types of hadith, and these are things that are discussed in ilm al-dirayat al-hadith. Number 3 is ijma', consensus. Ijma' for our Sunni brothers is very big thing. They very much rely on ijma'. And ijma' for them can be ijma', consensus of Muslims, or consensus of Muslim scholars, or ijma' or what they call ahlul hal wal aqd, people who close and open, means people who are decision makers. It can be even ijma' ulama of one city, ijma' ulama al-Madinah, ijma' ulama al-Basra. So they don't really look for consensus of 100% of Muslims in the world. They restrict it. And it can be at any generation. Even if today there is ijma', then it's hujjah for them. And they quote this hadith from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in which he is quoted as saying that my ummah would never agree on an error. لا تجتمع أمتي or لن تجتمع or لا تجتمع أمتي على خطأ. My ummah would never agree on error. So they say, if Muslims agree on something, this is right. According to the Shia, this hadith, first of all, is not verified. Secondly, even if this hadith is verified, it never happens. When is the time that all ummah agree on something? You may say, oh, all ummah agree on salat, all ummah agree on hajj. Yes, but for them we don't need ijma'. They are badihi. For badihiyat, for self-evident things, we don't need ijtihad. We don't need, refer to ijma'. Things which are badihi, and they are mentioned also in the Quran, Sunnah, everyone knows. But apart from those things which are badihi, dharuri, self-evident, everyone knows, where is ijma'? That all Muslims agree on something which is not badihi. Number 2. Number 3, we have cases that Muslims have made mistakes. If you remove ma'soom, infallible, Muslims can agree on something mistaken. If one person can make mistake, 1,000 people also can make mistake. Yes, the chance maybe becomes less if more people agree. But there is no guarantee that all Muslims, would agree on something which is right. How it can actually ever, happen, and if it happens, what is the proof? For Shia, the only thing that can save consensus from collapse, can give validity to consensus, is if ma'soom is included among those people who make consensus. How? If in the time of ma'soom we see that all the Muslims or all the Shia or all the ulama of Shia had certain understanding, we realize that this must be something that was inspired by Imam, or at least Imam didn't stop it, because it was in his time and everyone had this idea. How did he keep silent if he didn't approve? So for us, ijma' goes back to Sunnah. Ijma is only valid if it can help us to understand Sunnah. We say al-ijma'u yakunu kashifan an qawl al-ma'soom. Ijma can only be hujjah when it's helping us to understand Sunnah. I am finishing in a few minutes. I know that it has taken longer than expected, but I want to finish this lesson because otherwise I have to repeat many things. So, ijma is only valid if it is in the time of ma'soom and can help us to understand that ma'soom was happy. Therefore, ijma goes back to Sunnah for us. Yes, there is an idea that some scholars like Sheikh Tusi had about ijma' hadsi, and that's different, and that is not very common among the Shia. And that is, for example, to say that even if today all the Shia scholars agree on something, we can understand that Imam Mahdi was happy, because otherwise Imam Mahdi would at least have suggested to some of them something different so that all Shia would not agree on a mistake. But many ulama don't accept this. And actually, there were cases that all Shia jurists had an idea and later changed. For example, up to the time of Allama Hilli, at least almost consensus was there that water of well is not current. Ma'ul bir is not jari, is not current, is not considered as flowing. But Allama Hilli changed his fatwa because he reflected more and he didn't find it convincing. But before that, as you know the famous story, he said to fill his own well in home so that he's not affected by desire for convenience, so that he has no well himself. And then he investigated again and he said no, it's current water. So it's possible that ulama can make mistake. We never say our ulama or maraja are ma'soom. Never ever we don't say our ulama or maraja are ma'soom. But we say they have best understanding available in our generation of the view of ma'soom, and we have hujjah to follow them. We cannot say if their fatwa is definitely 100% is view of ma'soom, but we can say definitely this is hujjah, because this is the best way that we have. And this is prescribed by Ma'sumin. Okay, this is number 3. And finally, aql. The fourth source for the Shia is aql, is intellect, is reason. And inshallah later we will see there are some areas in Usul al-Fiqh that we talk about rational understanding and reasoning which can be applied to fiqh. Like ijtima'ul amr wa nahy, like muqaddamatul wajib, dalalatun, for example, nahy al fasad. This type of thing, inshallah, we'll talk about them. These are things that we can understand them from aql. Plus, aql is the one that, of course, helps us in all this process of reasoning. But that is not aql as a dalil. That is aql as a guide. But even aql as a source has a great place in our fiqh, that we will talk about it, inshallah, later. So, alhamdulillah, we managed to finish lesson 2. And inshallah, in the next session, we go to lesson 3, which is a brief history of Usul al-Fiqh, and inshallah maybe lesson 4 as well. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless our ulama, whether they are alive or they have passed away, and on our behalf reward them very generously, and help us to inshallah follow the path of a scholarly approach to Islam, inshallah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Thank you very much, Shaykhna.
You're
very
welcome.
Informative session.
You're
and
welcome.
a lot to think about there. So it doesn't seem like there's any questions from today's session. However, we have 1 or 2 from last week.
Yes.
If it's okay, I'll ask you.
Sure.
There was a brother who asked, is it possible to reach the level of ijtihad by studying theology at a university, or does it have to be in the Hawza?
Yeah. The place is not important. What is important is the level of knowledge. There might be Hawzas which cannot offer this level of training. There are many Hawzas that they don't have enough expertise to train mujtahid. Only some mother Hawzas, some main Hawzas can offer this, not every Hawza. And as far as I know, there is no university that has such a program of 20 years of study, 15 years of study. It's not impossible. Maybe some universities, try to do this. In Iran, there were attempts to bring this into some universities that were hopeful, that they could be like modern Hawzas. But because normally in the university system, you have very fixed structure. You have, BA, MA, PhD, and someone when he's doing PhD, one Risala or essay, then it's finished, it's graduating. But ijtihad is something that is not a matter of quantity or even a quality like quality of PhD. Maybe someone studies all his life and never becomes mujtahid. So it's possible theoretically, but so far we don't have universities that can offer this training, and we don't have even this in every Hawza. It's only available in some major Hawzas. Yes, in elementary level, intermediate level, in many Hawzas, but up to level of ijtihad, not everywhere.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
For that clear response. Another question we have is, can you explain the difference between discernment and judgment according to the Holy Quran and the Ahlul Bayt's teachings?
We should first decide, what terms are referred to by these two, because discernment and judgment are English terms, and I have to see what equivalence for them this person had in mind, this brother or sister, so that I can explain the difference. What do they mean by discernment and judgment in Islamic terminology? Because in English, if it's a matter of English, I can say what's the difference, for example, between discernment and judgment. But if it's a matter of Quranic and Arabic terminology, then we have to know which equivalence. In English, discernment is a matter of making distinction, to distinguish between things which look similar, but they have very delicate differences. For example, to discern what type of treatment you should take, to discern what type of, friendship you should make. And judgment is normally more about a matter of yes and no. Is this good or not? Is this reliable or not? Is this person truthful or not? So they overlap. But if you want to talk about something particular in Islamic terminology, I need to know what Arabic or Islamic equivalence this brother or sister had in mind.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
There is a comment in the chat from Yilmaz saying, can you please answer my previous question? I would just politely ask if you're able to repeat that question that you wanted to be answered from the previous week. If you put it on the chat, inshallah, we can ask Sheikh to answer it.
Inshallah, no question will be missed. Just maybe we need to, inshallah, address them the next session. If any question is missed, please resend it, because the intention is to answer every question.
Okay. So, We have a question here from Brother Muzammil. It says, if we are reliably informed that the Imam or the Prophet wasn't doing a certain action, but everyone else was doing it, do we disregard the action?
This is a technical question. If they didn't do something, it doesn't mean that it was haram. It could mean that it was makruh. So when there is a hadith, a text, a linguistic evidence, we can use it zahir. We can use it like umum or itlaq. But when there is action, action doesn't have zahir. You have to keep it to the minimum. This is a technical discussion. So what you can understand from action is limited. It's less than what you can understand from a text.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a question here. Are you able to elaborate on what you mean by hujjah? You mentioned this term in your talk. If you can maybe just define it for us, please.
Sure. Hujjah means something by which we can understand the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Something that on the day of judgment you can say to Allah that this is the reason I believed in this, or I behaved in this way, I practiced this way. I have said this in some places that the best definition of hujjah that I have seen so far is in Ziyarat al-Yasin. Assalamu alayka ya hujjatallahi wa dalila iradatih. Hujjatullah is dalil of iradatullah, is the sign of will of God. Quran is hujjah because through Quran we can understand the will of God. Prophet is hujjah because through the Prophet we can understand the will of God. Imam is hujjah because we can understand the will of God. And then Khabarul Wahid, for example, Khabarul Mutawatir, fatwa of a qualified marja, these are also hujjah in the sense that we can act upon them and make sure that we have observed the will of God in the best possible way for us. So hujjah means this. Means, although it is translated as proof, but maybe proof is not very clear. So we can say a way, a sign, an indicator of the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, expectation of Allah, demand of Allah from us.
Great. Thank you very much. And just coming back to that question about the difference between judgment and discernment, would you like to mention anything about basirat, as is mentioned here, that maybe we can refer to this as discernment?
Basira is normally translated as insight. And basira is a way of understanding things which are hidden. You know, we have basar and basira. Basar is to see obvious things. With your eyes, you see who is tall, who is short, who is, I don't know, present, who is absent. This is basar, vision. But basira is to understand something which is not visible. It's not on the surface so that you can see. It's deeper. This is called basira. And normally basira is needed in moral, social issues, that you cannot see things clearly, but if you have that insight, that kind of ability given by Allah to you, by hearing things that other people hear, by watching things that other people can watch, you come to a different conclusion because you have insight. You can understand what is behind, for example, these beautiful words. Maybe someone who has no basira would be trapped So, oh, this person is very nice, very polite, very respectful. But the one who has basira sometimes understand what is behind these beautiful words. Or sometimes maybe a person is not very polite, but you know there is honesty behind these words. Sometimes. So anyway, basira is insight. It's better to translate it as insight. Maybe discern is good for furqan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إن تتقوا الله يجعل لكم فرقانا. Furqan is good for discern because you make a distinction and understand, between right and wrong, good and bad, good and better, and so on and so forth.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And maybe we can take one more or two more. We'll try for one more because we also want to have Islamic plan for life. The question is, do we have details? It says, Salam Shaykh.
Alaykum salam.
Please elaborate on the part of the Sunnah that was part of the Prophet's life as an Arab or tradesman shepherd. And the same brother has also just mentioned it here. Please comment on the acts of the Prophet that were related to his position as an Arab or a 7th century human or tradesman shepherd. Do they form part of the Sunnah?
We believe that prophets were ma'soom, infallible, all their life. So whether before they were actually appointed as prophet or after, they are always ma'soom. So they don't do anything wrong. But practically speaking, we don't have that many of sayings of the Prophet from before. What we have practically is after he became Prophet. And then one of the jobs of mujtahid, whether it is for the Prophet or Imams, is to understand what he did or what he said. Was it a matter of religious requirement, or was it just a practical way of dealing with that thing in that culture? This is ijtihad. Some people who are very strict in other schools of Islam, they take things literally and say, this was done by the Prophet, this is Sunnah, this was not done, this is Bid'ah. They take things literally. But we have mujtahids. Mujtahids would understand that this thing which was done or was not done at that time, was it because of a religious reason or it was a practical reason? Is it something that we can be flexible, we can have some space to bring new ideas, or it is fixed? This is big area that we need mujtahids for, because they are so much learned and knowledgeable about the entire Quran and Sunnah that they can tell us that based on this evidence, this evidence, this evidence, what this Ma'soom did was not a permanent ruling of Islam. It was just something temporary, or it was for that culture. But this is not job of everyone that says everything which was done was cultural, and we end up with having nothing fixed.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Sheikh.
You are welcome. Thank you for the good questions. May Allah bless all of you. Those who are participants, those who ask questions, those who listen, those who reflect, and inshallah those who do mubahasa.
Yes.
We should encourage brothers and sisters to do mubahasa, inshallah.